of people over the last 4 years. Since retiring 4 years ago, I've focused, as Professor Ludman said, on two areas, health policy, in particular, single-payer healthcare in New York State, and on climate change. And in the course of that, I've worked with a number of people who have contributed valuable information and slides to this presentation that I'm giving you, and I've listed them here below. First, my background. Dr. Ludman gave you some of it. I was trained, as he said, as a nuclear physicist. I taught urban studies and climate change at Queens College for 10 years and urban studies for 35. While teaching climate change, I taught my students what was, and I'm afraid in many quarters still is, the conventional wisdom. First, that a vast expansion of solar and wind energy is essential to address the climate crisis. And two, that nuclear energy is too risky and too expensive to be considered. In the last 4 years, what I've learned is that I was wrong on both counts, and I want to show you why in this presentation. And here's an overall simple outline. First, where New York State is now in terms of its energy use. Two, what the state's plan for a fossil-free future is, using principally wind and solar energy. Three, I want to show you an alternative plan using nuclear energy. And finally, I want to address briefly the question of, is nuclear right for the job? So 2 years ago, the governor signed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA, as it's fondly referred to. It's treated as historic and landmark. We don't know yet whether that's going to be the case, and I have serious questions, as I'll explain as we proceed. So here are its main goals. In terms of energy, there are other goals, but these are the key ones. First of all, by 2030, that 70% of our electricity will come from renewable sources. By 2040, electricity will emit that we generate will generate no greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, in 2050, that all of our energy needs will be met with no net greenhouse gas emissions. So there's three decades overseen here, viewed in the terms of these goals. However, when the legislation was passed, no plan existed to meet these goals, either in anybody's research or in the minds of the people who put forward the legislation. It did set up a Climate Action Council to develop a plan, and it's still deliberating and is due to come up with a plan, something it's referred to as a scoping plan, sometime within the next year. So I will get to plans in a moment. Let me first talk about where we are today in terms of energy use. First of all, you'll notice that the first two goals are in terms of electricity, the final one, energy. That is all energy use. Electricity is about 40%, accounts for about 40% of our energy consumption, but transportation and buildings, particularly residential and commercial buildings, account for even more of our energy use. In terms of electricity, in terms of overall use, you can see that petroleum and natural gas account for a large majority today, over almost 70% of the total. Here's electricity by 70, and what you'll see is that achieving that 70% renewable goal by 2030 will not be easy. This shows how we will be generating electricity in the coming year. Almost half will be from fossil fuels. Renewables will account for 31%, of which solar and wind are just 7%. And hydro is 22% and cannot really grow by very much. With the major rivers that have flow that can be can be dammed and through which you can generate electricity the dams have been created on the Niagara and St. Lawrence rivers. So solar and wind have to grow, if you do the math, have to grow from 7% to more than 35%. That's a big jump in 8 years. So let me give you some perspective on the sources we're talking about, which is solar, wind, and nuclear. Solar and wind in New York State supply less than half of the output of the Indian Point nuclear plant, which many of you may know is about 35 miles north of Midtown Manhattan. There's a picture of it there. It has two reactors, both of which are now shut down, largely because of fears from some of the neighbors of that plant and from the governor, Andrew Cuomo. What the lower picture shows is that one of the two turbines, the reactor generates heat and then steam. The steam goes through and drives those turbines. The interesting and quite remarkable thing is that that turbine generates more electricity than all the solar and wind that we have ever established in New York State, let's say over the last 20 years or maybe longer. And that one plant generated more than twice as much as all the solar and wind in the state. Or to put it another way, in terms of nuclear physics, the nuclear force is 1 million times stronger than the chemical force, which is what is used basically to convert sunlight and wind energy into electricity. So this is a very dense, very concentrated form of energy. That one turbine you're looking at provided an eighth of all the electricity used in the downstate area when it was running until it was closed down. That one was closed, as I said, a year ago, and the second a few months ago. We were told when the closure was announced 4 years ago that nuclear power would be replaced with clean energy, that is energy that didn't produce greenhouse gases. That was not the case. It was not true then, and it's evidently not true now. Here's a picture of the effect of the closure, looking in the 6 months following the closure of Unit 1 and then the closure of Unit 2. Hydropower, you see, basically not affected. Solar and wind are still very small, about less than 10% of the total energy. Nuclear power dropped, as we expect. There are 3 nuclear plants upstate which continue to run, but the largest nuclear plant in New York State was the operating plant was the Indian Point plant. And you can see that as nuclear dropped, fossil fuel use increased, and our imports of electricity from other states, we don't know how they were generated, but however they were generated, they increased too, in order to make up for the loss of power from the solar and wind. Of course, didn't increase. It takes time and money to expand them. So what is this? That's the picture as it stands right now. What's the state's plan for a fossil fuel future using wind and solar energy? Well, as I said, the Climate Action Council is supposed to come up with a plan and hasn't yet, but we have 2 plans on the table that have been put forward by state entities. One is from NISO, the New York Independent System Operator. This is a nonprofit corporation responsible for maintaining the grid, the electric grid in New York State. And it put forward a plan and a proposal which it presented to the Climate Action Council at one of its meetings a year ago for what would the electric grid and electric sources look like in 2040 if we follow the guidelines of the CLCPA. And here you can see on the right-hand column the amount of land-based wind, offshore wind, solar, battery storage, and DE resource, which I will come back to at some length in a few minutes. And you can see on the left where we stand now in terms of capacity, electric capacity. One thing to note here is, there are a number of things to note. One is the electric load has increased a bit. That reflects the projection that by 2040, there will be more electric vehicles, there will be more heat pumps heating buildings. So the electric load will grow much more than the population will grow, but still it grows by about 30 or 40%. But the capacity grows by a factor of 4. And that is because of the characteristics of the renewable sources of wind and solar. Mainly, they're small capacity factors. So it's important to understand what the capacity factor is. It's the amount of electricity generated in a year as a ratio of what it could produce if that generator operated full out, full time. And so what you can see, this figure is from NISO. So it's what we actually get in New York State on our electric grid from the 4 carbon-free sources: hydroelectric power, wind power, solar power, and nuclear power. And you can see the capacity factor for wind is 29%. Capacity factor for solar is 14%. That is basically only 1/7 of the potential that solar energy could produce is actually available over the year. Of course, half of it you can't get because it's nighttime, and then there's cloudy weather, and then there's weaker sunlight in winter than in summer. So what you can get on June 22nd, when the sun is brightest, if we had that all year, we'd have a capacity factor of 1, but in fact, it's only 14%. The result is that the conclusion there is that wind and solar have small capacity factors and low energy density. That is, takes a lot of land, a lot of space to gather the energy that comes from the sun or the wind to convert it into energy. So we need lots of them because of the small capacity factor, and they're going to be occupying very great swaths of land across the state. All right, well, here's a graphic picture of what the NISO study forecast for 2040. So first of all, it uses 5 megawatt turbines, and there's a little picture comparing it to the Eiffel Tower. It's about 2/3 of the blades go about 2/3 of the height up of the Eiffel Tower, but it means a very great expansion in the amount of wind we have today. Wind has not been growing over the last few years. You can see it's now a little bit less than 2,000 megawatts. And it's got to grow, according to the NISO projection, to 35,000 in 20 years. Well, it's a whole dramatic change in the wind energy, land-based wind industry, but offshore wind is also very important in their study. They call for 2,010 megawatt turbines, very, very large turbines. At the moment, New York has none. In fact, the United States as a whole has 5 turbines. They're 5 megawatt each, and they're off of Rhode Island. That picture is not Rhode Island. That's a European wind farm. And for solar, we need almost 40,000 megawatts. We now have about 3,000 installed, but most of that 40,000 will be grid connected utility scale farms. We have only one of them in the state so far. That's a picture of it. It's near Brookhaven out on Long Island. It's 32, it has a capacity of 32 megawatts. We'd have to build 64 of them each year for the next 20 years to meet the NISO goal. Here's a picture of what, this is a graphic, using Google Maps of the current queue, that is, these are projects that are proposed, wind and solar projects that are proposed for New York State. The big green in the middle is this large state park, Appalachian State Park, Adirondack State Park, I mean. But every place else, the New York State will be blanketed with solar farms and wind farms if this plan were to go into effect. And then there's the offshore wind to add to it. The environmental impact of this has not yet been analyzed. Now, the NISO study didn't provide any cost figures, but NYSERDA, which is the State Energy Research and Development Agency, and they're responsible for providing information to the Climate Action Council, they presented cost figures in the most recent meeting of the Climate Action Council. So we have some cost estimates of what this kind of plan will cost. And here's their figure for 2050. They looked all the way to 2050. Remember, in 2050, all energy has to be either emission-free or has to be balanced by some carbon capture, so that there's no net greenhouse gas emissions in 2050. And you can see the investment cost in net present value is estimated to be close to $3 trillion, which is $400,000 per family over that 30-year period. Pretty substantial investment. So what's it made of? First of all, there's wind and solar, which is about 500 billion. We don't have NYSERDA has not actually presented a document, any report that provides us with information on what underlies these graphs. So we're forced at this point to use what we have, and here it is. So look, it's about $500 billion for electricity. I should mention that Mark Jacobson has a model that's similar for New York State. His figure for the renewable sources, mostly wind and solar, is $638 billion. So they're in the same ballpark. But NYSERDA has done something that no other organization that I'm aware of has done, which is to calculate what it will cost to convert all transportation and all buildings to being all electric, because this is an all electric future that we're projecting. If you're relying on wind and solar, then everything, what they generate is electricity. And so your buildings have to be electrically heated, not heated with like burning gas and oil, which most in New York State are. And we have to drive our cars with electricity, not with gas, and trucks, similarly. So you have to convert all transportation to electric, and you have to convert all buildings to electric heat. So this is the estimate that NYSERDA has come up with. We don't know the details, but for my purposes, they're not important, as you'll see. Now, there's another problem. Cost is not the only problem. The NISO study, this picture is from the NISO study, is that there's insufficient wind and sun for substantial parts of the year, so that the wind and solar sources don't produce enough electricity to meet the demands that are expected from the population's use of electricity. The gray is areas where the wind and solar, this is winter, a month in the winter, and there's a lull of almost a week where the wind doesn't blow enough, and of course there's very little sun in the winter. So you have an inadequate supply of electricity, so you need something to come in and fill the gap. In the summer, you have a similar problem. Let me point out also that there's a special case of insufficiency. This model provides electricity for New York City primarily from offshore wind. New York State, this is a longer story I could give you, but New York State has been referred to as a tale of two grids. It has an upstate grid that's primarily nuclear power, the nuclear plants along the Lake Erie, excuse me, and the water power. Not much of the electricity from upstate can get downstate because there are very limited number of transmission lines. Several more are going to be built, but they won't meet the need at all. So under this model, downstate will depend on offshore wind. But offshore wind, we know, for in the winter, in the summer, it runs into problems. There are lulls when there's days on end where there's very little wind. And windmills, wind turbines, by the way, are very sensitive to wind speed. Their output goes like the cube of the wind speed. So you drop the speed by half and you're down to an eighth of the output. But also we get hurricanes, and we're going to be having more of them and more intense of them. And here's what happened to Puerto Rico when Hurricane Maria came through. You cannot depend on, this city cannot depend on offshore wind to power it. It needs something more. And the NISO study recognized that we need something more. There's this DE resource. DE stands for dispatchable and emission-free. It's an unspecified backup resource that, if you compare it, is larger than our fossil fuel use today. This is not some small thing that is applied at the end. It's a very large, because it has to carry the full electric load during times when the sun and the wind are inadequate. And in fact, NISO found that it ran less than 10% of the time, but it had to meet the full load when it was running. So NYSERDA found the same thing. It found that it also uses the same weather data, and so it also found that there are periods when it needed this backup resource comparable to gas, the amount of gas and oil we have, capacity that we have today. They refer to it not as a DE resource, but as zero carbon firm resource. Firm meaning it's always available. Zero carbon meaning, of course, it doesn't produce emissions. And you can see it's 25,000 megawatts. It is as large as our current fossil fuel capacity. But also, you'll notice their sizes. They too have they have even more solar in their model than NISO did. They have 60 gigawatts of solar. Today we have 3. Now, what about generation? Well, that firm resource, in their model, they only use it between 1% and 3% of the time. So you have to build this resource, this energy source, which is between 25 and 30,000 megawatts of capacity, but you're only using it less than 3% of the time. And NYSERDA didn't say what the implication of that was, but NISO did. This is from a slide that NISO presented to the Climate Action Council a year ago, and I'll read it to you. It says, large quantities of installed dispatchable energy resources needed in a small number of hours. Dispatchable means it's available when needed, and you can turn it on. You'll get the power you need when you need it. Solar and wind, of course, are weather dependent. They're available when the weather cooperates, when you get clear skies and sunlight or heavy winds, but that's not adequate. And here's their picture. And NYSERDA has similar pictures where solar and wind are inadequate. And as NISO wrote, I'll read the second one, dispatchable resources must be able to come online quickly, be flexible enough to meet rapid, steep ramping needs. Ramping means to increase rapidly to meet the fluctuations in the solar and wind. So this kind of all renewable path has many problems. It may look good to put a solar panel on your roof, but for all of society, it breaks down. It's what some mathematician would call a fallacy of composition. If you're in a theater and you can't see, if you stand up, you'll see better. But if everybody stands up, you'll be just as bad off as you were before. That's basically what's happening here. solar and wind look good individually, but powering our society is a whole different story. There's this extremely large physical build out. There's a use of land, materials. Where's the workforce going to come for this multiplication by factors of 10 and more in the number of people working on installing all these solar and wind facilities? And then the environmental impacts. Put that Brookhaven solar farm across New York State, and you can understand why people in New York State are upset that their rural land is being transformed through industrial solar and wind to provide energy for we city folks. There's the technical problems of the intermittency and insufficiency of solar and wind. I haven't talked about battery backup. It's in the models, but it's very expensive, and we don't have anything approaching the kind of long-term storage you would need to meet the problems of wintertime. You need a dispatchable backup, as we said, and you'll need more transmission lines because of the far-flung nature of solar and wind installations. And then, of course, there's the cost and the public resistance. NIMBY is not in my backyard. The resistance to having upstate and Long Island land transformed to accommodate these land-hungry facilities. So what's an alternative? Fortunately, there is one, but it will use nuclear energy, which is not in that plan. Our sense is that under the Cuomo administration, discussion of nuclear energy was forbidden. And we have a new governor, and hopefully we can use the word nuclear and won't be thrown out of the room, and that we'll be in a different situation. So let me talk about this backup power that is required by the renewable plan. First of all, as we said, it has to be dispatchable and free of greenhouse gases. It has to be able to supply up to the full maximum load when and if needed. So what are the options? First of all, you can use biomass. That is, you can burn wood or crops, but there's limited and they're destructive of the land and of the environment. Geothermal isn't really available in New York State. It is in some parts of the West, but it's limited. You could use natural gas if you could capture the carbon dioxide coming out and sequester it. That will add substantially to the cost of burning natural gas, and it's not yet available in any significant quantity. One of the models that people who support only a renewable only plan envision is burning hydrogen instead of burning methane, which is a carbon based fuel. Burn hydrogen, but you need more renewables than I've shown in those slides to produce the hydrogen, because you need electricity, renewable generated electricity, to pull the hydrogen out of water, which is where you get the hydrogen. And that just makes the cost and the environmental impact even greater. So finally, there's nuclear, and nuclear is available and scalable. It can be expanded. We know how to do it. We've done it in the United States in the 60s and 70s. We went from no nuclear power to providing 20% of our electricity within 20 years. France, in 10 years, went from no nuclear to providing over 70% of its electricity. So let's think further. How about using nuclear not as a backup, not just for 3% of the time, but as its backbone? That is, why build nuclear power? Why build power plants large enough to carry nearly the full electric load of the state and then use them just 3% of the time? How about starting with this source as the backbone of the system and letting solar and wind be supplemental to it instead of it being supplemental to them? So one issue is that extra cost. Well, with nuclear plants, the added fuel costs of running it full time rather than running it just 3% of the time is just a minor part of the total cost of building a nuclear plant. And with this approach, you need much less solar and wind, you'd save land, you'd save cost, and you'd protect the rural environment. And with nuclear, as I'll show you in a minute, you won't have to electrify everything. This is a picture of, by the way, of Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, which is a sister plant to Indian Point. It's scheduled in California to be shut down in 2025, which would be totally foolish, just as it was foolish to shut down our Indian Point plant. So here's a simple plan. What it will cost: build enough nuclear plants to produce the full electric load that NISO forecasts, which is 320,000 gigawatt hours per year. That would take 20 plants, like 2,000 megawatt plants like the one at Indian Point. And at about $3,500 per kilowatt capital cost, that would cost $140 billion. And what I've shown you here is the historical cost. The U.S. was producing plants here at $2,000 or less per kilowatt. After the 3 Mile Island accident, all kinds of additional safety measures were put in, and the cost went up substantially in the U.S. Then we stopped building. Other countries went ahead building, and here's Canada, Germany, Japan. So I'm using 3,500, which seems like a reasonable number here in the middle. South Korea is producing them today at about $2,000 per kilowatt. So it would cost about $140 billion for this simplified plan, rather than NYSERDA's $500 billion for the solar and wind model. And we don't have to pay to electrify everything. Now, how can that be? That's the sort of final major thing I want to talk about. Nuclear power, unlike solar and wind, has many uses besides generating electricity, because what nuclear power generates is heat. One thing you can do with the heat is convert it to use the heat to generate steam, and the steam runs a turbine. That's what Indian Point did. They run a turbine, but you can also use the heat directly. You can use the heat to generate hydrogen or other chemicals, as I'll show you in a minute. You can use it to desalinate water. You can use it in heavy industry, where that is, instead of burning coal to make steel, you can use the heat from nuclear power for steel making or for cement making. There are a variety of other uses that nuclear power could, and the heat that it generates can be used for. One really important example is to create carbon neutral hydrocarbons. That is, you pull carbon, much of the carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, 2/3 of it, in fact, when we burn fossil fuels, initially the CO2 goes into the atmosphere, but 2/3 of it ends up in the ocean. So if you could pull carbon dioxide out of the ocean, plus the hydrogen, of course, it's in the water, combine them with a process referred to as the Fischer-Tropsch process, which is well known. You can use that to generate any kind of hydrocarbon you choose by using a cracking system and a refinery. The Germans produced their aviation fuel during World War II that way, because they had limited access to oil fields, just the smallish Romanian ones. So they used that process during the war. There are a number of plants around the world that produce fuel from methane. So this is a process that's well known, and in fact, the Navy has spent Naval Research Laboratory has spent the last 10 years developing a process to produce jet fuel from seawater. Its carriers are already nuclear powered. They have nuclear reactors on board. So they could use that instead of having to go someplace, find a ship that's carrying fuel oil to power the aircraft that are on the carriers. They could produce the jet fuel on the carrier and be completely self-sufficient. So the Navy has a module. It's actually not small and natural gas powered. It's based down in Key West at a naval base. And it's a process that works, and they produce jet fuel there and can fly airplanes with it. And it's carbon neutral. You pull the carbon out of the ocean, you burn the fuel, the carbon goes into the atmosphere, and within a year or two, the carbon's back in the ocean again. You can also use biomass in the same kind of process. Take corn or other products and convert them into synfuels, as they have been called. So you can save hundreds of billions of dollars. You can distribute these carbon neutral fuels through the existing pipelines and the existing transportation networks to carry fuel to where it's needed. So instead of the expenditures that we have, first of all, the electricity cost is lower, but you don't need to convert all of your transportation system to electric power. And of course, you can fly your airplanes with this carbon neutral fuel instead of whatever people are imagining to use to fly airplanes. And you don't have to convert every house in the country or in the state to all electric use. You can use this carbon neutral fuel to just put in the pipelines and heat your home with it. So the question is nuclear right for the job? That's my last question. And those of us who advocate nuclear run into a lot of skepticism. I'll read you this little cartoon. Since you are knowledgeable about nuclear power, it means you're not impartial. I can only trust someone who doesn't know what he's talking about, says the cartoon. In fact, the more you learn, my view is the more you learn about nuclear, the better it looks. Here's the set of criteria you would have for this dispatchable emission-free generator that both NISO and NYSERDA say we need, and that I've proposed as a simple backbone for our carbon-free system. First of all, it's got to be carbon-free, doesn't emit carbon or greenhouse gases. It should use minimal amounts of land. Certainly, nuclear plant does that. It should have minimal material use. It's very small plant, very dense, energy dense. It can be deployed rapidly, and both the U.S. and France have shown that can be done. It is safe. In fact, except for the people who died, the first responders who died at Chernobyl, no one has ever died or been killed by a nuclear accident. The waste issue, it can in fact be handled. There's a very elegant solution using basically well drilling technology, and it's affordable. The plant we're building now in Georgia is very expensive, and I think it may be in the Carolinas, but it's very expensive because it's the only one we've built in the last 30 years. But if you build them, there's a very steep learning curve. You learn fast, and you can make nuclear very affordable. I'm not going to go into the details here. I think I've taken enough time. So, but they're attached. There are slides for them giving the data on each one of these issues. And if you have questions in the Q&A, I'll be happy to answer them. So here's my conclusions. First of all, the path that emphasizes renewable energy is environmentally destructive, very costly, and has to be backed up by a large dispatchable emission-free source. Nuclear energy is the only such source that can expand rapidly enough to avoid catastrophic climate change. Nuclear energy is environmentally friendly, safe, and affordable, but the public's exaggerated concern about nuclear power has to be overcome. There are many companies that are developing new models that are safer, smaller, more flexible, but there's a large swath of the public that still is anxious about nuclear, and we have to work on reducing that anxiety. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. Oh, finally, let me share the screen once more. If I can, yeah, okay. I'll be glad to take questions by email if people want to. And the slides are available. I've given them to Professor Ludman, but they're also available online.